Greetings, Earthlings. My name is Dustin Cormier. Welcome to another episode of How to Rock Astrology. Continuing our Interpreting the Outer Planets series, particularly talking to stability and conductivity, we are at the place where we are now talking about dignity. We actually just talked about dignity. Now we're looking at the prosperity of the house, plus Rashi aspects to the house, as given by Ryan Kirksack of Asheville Tropical Vedic Astrology. And Ryan basically gets this. This is kind of like a Jaimini technique that is being noted here. I believe that Jaimini had this idea of the Rashi aspects. It's different from regular aspects. When you have something, there's a whole schema behind it. Look up Rashi aspects if you feel like it. It's a whole science of astrology unto itself. So the prosperity of the house is the house, of course, and the sign that a planet is in is the fertility of the ground. It's whether or not the universe conspires to enliven the properties of the planet. How can you take the seed of a very good planet and put it in ugly soil where it won't grow? You must put a seed in the proper soil in order for it to grow. Now, a good seed will kind of like grow no matter what, but how much better would it grow if the house had an intrinsic prosperity? In order to define the prosperity or annihilation of the house, we need to dig into a technique given by Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra. So that's what we're up to today. We are going to determine the prosperity of third and fourth houses in particular. I know that this whole series I'm going to be calling it the prosperity of the lords, but this prosperity relates particularly to the house, which is holding the outer planets. That's what I meant to say, not the outer lords. The outer planets. So in Charlie Sheen's chart in particular, we know that the Sun and Mars, the Sun and Mercury are kind of holding the outer planet energy. Particularly Mercury, because Pluto and Uranus are in Virgo, so therefore Mercury holds Pluto and Uranus's energy. So that's, where the third house comes in is that Mercury is in Leo, that third house. So that's why we're looking at the prosperity of the fourth house, where the outer planets are, as well as the house which contains their dispositor, because they are both intricately involved in the outer planets, Pluto and Uranus, in this chart. More particularly, we would usually just look at the prosperity of Virgo, because Virgo's holding the outer planets. But Virgo, through Mercury, is in a mutual yoga with the Sun. Leo is the sign that Mercury occupies. Virgo is the sign that the Sun occupies. And Virgo also contains Uranus and Pluto. So, the Sun being the holder of Mercury, and Mercury being the holder of the outer planets, and them being intertwined like this shows the nature of the complexity of humans. Humans are more complex than we think. It's frustrating to see all this data and to think that it's an impertinent part of describing the strength of an outer planet. But this is just what we have to do. Now you got to dig that, in this series, I just want to give a little glimpse and just let you guys know that if you've been watching so far, very good on you, because this is a really in detail thing. Eventually, I'm going to be doing. I'm describing and discussing all these little details because I have to. Eventually, we're going to be doing case studies where we just chunk the whole thing, all of these little lessons into one picture, and we're going to be doing that in later case studies. For now, we're describing all the little details so that we can see what all the little details mean and how they all add up. Again, this is a Gemini Lagna, which means Leo, the third house, is inauspicious, but Mercury ruling the first and the fourth house is auspicious to the Lagna. So this is what Parashara Hora Shastra gives to us to define the prosperity or annihilation of a house. It can be rather confusing because I keep mixing between like, is it the house or the Lord that I'm looking at? But this list, particularly the actual quote from Parashara, will give you the exact specifics. So feel free to read all this over in order to learn about how to quantify the house itself, which is holding a planet. So we're going to be looking back into it, okay? First thing we want to do is to learn how prosperous is the house that the sun rules. The reason we're asking this is because the sun, the third house, is where Mercury lies. So we need to know about the house that's holding Mercury because Mercury is the dispositor of the fourth house. Once we learn about the health of Mercury, then we can learn about once we learn the health of the house that Mercury is in, then we can learn about the house itself, which the outer planets are in, which is going to be our next one, right? The fourth house itself. For now, we need to know the health of the house, which Mercury is expressing itself through. And that is Leo. So we're going to be looking at basically all these sorts of things, you know. Eventually we see that this third house of Leo has more prosperity than annihilation. It's looking pretty good for the third house itself, which ultimately looks good on Mercury, because that's where the health of Leo is going to help with the health of Mercury, and vice versa, as we'll see. So, number 1. Is the house itself occupied by a benefic? You can see I've had to stop and start my video because I was calculating these wrong. Now we are where we need to be. Is the house itself occupied by a benefic? Well, Mercury is in the third house, but Mercury is not a benefic inherently. It's only when Mercury is with a benefic that it becomes a benefic, or it becomes a malefic if it's with a malefic. Blends to whatever it's close to. Here, it doesn't have any planets with it, so it's naturally neutral. Doesn't count as benefic. Doesn't count as a prosperity point. At least in this measure. Now, is the house Lord? Make sure when you're going through this list, be very careful and cautious to be sure if you're talking about the house itself or the house Lord, because it's easy to get confused. What was I looking at again, right? Is the house Lord conjunct or aspected by a benefic? Now, this is important because, of course, the Lord and the house are one. The house expresses its potentials through the Lord, and the Lord stabilizes the house of the energy with its activity. So that's why half of this list consists of aspects and Rashi aspects in the condition of the house Lord, because the house Lord carries the house. So we're looking if the house Lord of Leo, which is the sun, is it conjunct or aspected by a benefic? We can see that the sun is not conjunct any benefics, but it is being aspected by 2 benefics. We have the benefic moon. The moon is benefic because it's ahead of the sun and it's before the full moon. It's waxing. And we also have the benefic Jupiter is also aspecting the house Lord. So these 2 are good. Remember, these are Rashi aspects. So the mutable signs, Virgo, Sagittarius, Pisces, and Gemini, they're all kind of connected. And when there's a planet in one of the mutable signs, it affects the houses of all the other mutable signs. It affects all the other mutable signs. So Jupiter being in Gemini is going to cause positive activity for Virgo, as well as Sagittarius and Pisces. That's how the Rashi aspects work. The moon, the positive moon here, is also going to make things easier at a lunar level, making the self come to adapt and understand Sagittarius, which is naturally going to rub off on Virgo. So we have 2 benefic aspects to the sun, which is the Lord of Leo, the third house. So that's 2 points of prosperity so far for Leo, the third house. is the house lord, the sun, in an adult state? That would be Yuva. So Yuva is anywhere between 12 to 18 degrees of a sign. These are called the Baladi Avashtas. We can actually see that the sun is actually in Vrida Avashta. That's the house lord of Leo. The Avashtas have to do with they say it's the age of the planet. Okay? Now, in order for me to lay out the schema, I got to give it to you this way. Essentially, if a planet's in an odd sign, or sorry, we're just talking about, if a house lord is in an odd sign. In this case, we're talking about the sun, so it's actually in an even sign, so we might as well just go right for that. The house lord of the third house is in Virgo, which is an even sign. So with the even signs, they go backwards in this age schema. I'm just going to lay this out for you just so you can see it, okay? In the odd signs, from 0 to 6 degrees of an odd sign, let's say it, Leo, Gemini, Aries, what have you. The first 0 to 6 degrees, I'm just going to do this just so you guys can see where I'm at. In an odd sign, like Gemini, Aries, Leo, etc., fire and air signs, the first 0 to 6 degrees is called Bala Avashta, which means like an infant. 6 to 12 is called Kumara Avashta. That's a point of prosperity if it's in there for odd signs. 12 to 18 is the best Baladi Avashta. It's the planet's in an adult state. And when it's in a Kumara and Yuva, when it's a teenager from 6 to 12, and an adult from 12 to 18 for odd signs, this gives the planet the capacity to richly experience whatever it's dealing with, to conceptualize its own nature, and to learn its own nature. And this has a huge prospective prosperity for the house itself, because the house is channeling its energy through the Lord, and if the Lord is a teenager or an adult, it's fresh. It can learn the ways of dealing with its house as well as everything else around it quicker, better, easier. So that's why it's a point of prosperity to have it in an odd sign between 6 and 12, and then between 12 and 18. From 18 to 24, it's called Vrida Avashta. It's an old age retired placement. The planet is growing old, and it's not as great of a place. Same thing with Mriti Avashta. If it's Mriti Avashta, it's a very negative point. It's from 24 degrees to 30 degrees of an odd sign. It's dead. It doesn't have the perspicacity, whatever that word is, to richly understand itself as its nature is in the world. It's kind of like just rolling with whatever its nature is, and when it finds things in the world that disagrees with its nature, it has a hard time adapting and learning the lessons of the house as relates to this life experience. So for the even signs, you can switch it. 30 degrees, so this is important for us now because the sun here, the sun in Charlie Sheen's chart, is in Virgo, okay? So, same thing, but backwards. From 30 degrees to 24 degrees, it's Bala, it's a infant Avashta. Then from 24 to 18, it's Kumara Avashta. Planets in even signs like Virgo, Scorpio, Capricorn, etc., when it's in an even sign, from 24 degrees to 18 degrees is like Kumara. It's a young adult. Still fresh, not so infant that it's like can't deal with the world, but it's young enough that it's new and fresh and can deal with things and learn about the way of its chart, learn about the house, learn about the reality that it's in, and how to integrate its nature with and adapt it to the reality at hand, which is a very good point of prosperity for any house lord. In this case, it's the sun, the third lord. It's in Virgo. So, yeah, in an even sign, from 24 to 18 is teenager. Then from 18 degrees in an even sign to 12 degrees is adult, Yuva. Very good point. It's the best place to be for any, whether it's odd or even. 12 to 18 degrees is the best place for a planet. Then from 12 to 6 degrees is Vrihat Avashta, and that's what this sun is in. In an even sign, it's from 12 degrees to 6 degrees, and this is a point of annihilation for the sun. So it's not Kumara, and it's not Yuva. Is the house lord awake? So what's that mean? We can always look at the actual Parashara text for the definition of what it is. Awake, it's Prabda Avashta, means if it's in its own home, if it's Mula Trikona, or exaltation. Or to a lesser degree, great friend and friend. It's kind of like dignity is basically what we're looking at here. So we can see that the sun is in, as we know from our previous class, it's in the sign of a friend. Now, that's not a huge point of prosperity. It's technically Jagrat, which is awake, but it's awake-ish. I would call it a half point of prosperity. Because it's in the sign of a friend. It's not a great friend. It's not exalted. It's not in its own sign. It's not exactly fully awake. It's the house lord in the 10th house. The reason that is good is because the 10th house has to do with our constant worldly activity in the world. And something that, again, it's just like with Yuva and Kumara Avashta. When we do something over and over a lot, the 10th house is like, it's our worldly activity. It's what we do for our career, and everyone sees us as that. So we always learn a lot about the 10th house. That's why having any planet in the 10th house is naturally a point of prosperity for the house that planet rules. Because that house is getting a lot of activity, and we are therefore learning a lot about how to deal with that house, and this helps the house grow. But this sun is not in the 10th house. Is the house lord aspecting its own house? We know that the sun is in Virgo, and the mutable signs only aspect each other. They don't aspect the fixed or cardinal houses. So no, the sun does not Rashi aspect its own house of Leo. And finally, is Mercury and or Jupiter Rashi aspecting the house itself? We see that Jupiter is in Gemini, and it is aspecting, it's Rashi aspecting the sun being in Virgo, but not the third house itself. This is particularly trying to see if Jupiter or Mercury are actually touching the house itself of Leo. Now, of course, here Mercury is. The third house of Leo is occupied by Mercury, which is like Jupiter. It's a power transducer. That's a kind of a word that describes how Mercury, the way of its lackadaisical, it's a constant activity in our lives. Especially if it's well placed. We all have Mercury somewhere. We all have a friendship management of our resources, and there's a playfulness with Mercury that we just naturally go towards in whatever house it's in and whatever house it aspects. So having Mercury here in the third is a very good, powerful point of prosperity. All in all, combine these all together, you get 3.5 points of prosperity for this third house, which is looking pretty good. Obviously, it's better than the Annihilation aspects. The Annihilation comes because the sun is not Rashi aspected by its own lord. This is number 2. Is the house not aspected by its lord? That's a point of prosperity. Just goes to show how powerful it is when the house does Rashi aspect its own lord. It's almost like a point off of prosperity and a point onto annihilation. It was kind of like 2 points when you think about it. Is the house occupied by a malefic? The third house is not occupied by a malefic. Essentially, you could read down here. Is the house lord, being the sun, is it with a cruel malefic planet? No, it's not. Is the house lord, the sun, is it with an evil house lord? The 6th, 8th, 12th also includes the 3rd and the 11th. The sun is the third lord, but it doesn't have with it any evil house lords of these houses. Is the house lord, again this being the sun, is it defeated in planetary war? This is usually determined by Shadbala in your Kala software. There's a word for it that I can't think of right now. Let me just check this. I believe that is Yuddha, plus or minus for Yuddha would mean planetary war. There's no planetary war, as we saw. It's all zeros, so there's no planetary war happening for the sun. And is the house lord in Vriddha or Mrita or Supta state? That's Vriddha and Mrita, as we know, is from being in certain degrees. This sun is in an even sign. It's between 6 and 12 degrees of an even sign, so it's Vriddha. It's old. Has a harder time coming to grips with what it needs to do as a house lord in its nature. But it's not Supta. It's awake-ish, which is a point of prosperity, not annihilation. So overall, this third house isn't looking so bad. It's looking more prosperous than, annihilated, especially with these two aspects by benefics moon and Jupiter. And the third house itself being occupied by Mercury is always a powerful prosperity figure. The language that we speak helps, the very language that we constantly speak helps to build the capacity for us to deal with the house that it's in this case, the third house of Leo. So Mercury being there just aids Leo, the third sign itself, quite a bit. Which is all good, very good for Mercury. We're going to talk about why essentially this whole thing, this prosperity of the third house, is all to show what Mercury can do as in its house, because Mercury is the one carrying the outer planet energy, right? So again, as we've been saying, even though the sun is considered inauspicious, because Gemini is not natural to the themes of the sun and the third house are still important to any Lagna. And as we've said, there's always a light side and a dark. So we need this sun. This is not an auspicious planet, but it's like a hole in the bucket. And if Charlie Sheen has prosperity for Leo, the third house, and for the sun, this helps to patch up the holes in the bucket so that the water of Mercury can go farther and he can get more out of the use of Mercury. So this is a good thing that the sun has prosperity. The third house where Mercury resides has prosperity. Now we're actually going to talk about the fourth house itself, which is the house itself, which is carrying the outer planets. This is really the more important picture. Although we already know that it's going to be aided by the fact that Mercury is in a prosperous house, right? Let me just check again. You guys can see me good. So how prosperous is this fourth house? Well, essentially, you guys have seen this list, so I'm not gonna smash your heads against it. I'm essentially just gonna cut to the chase and show you what I've done through my own digging through. Again, it looks like a lot of annoying work, but once you drill it through, you can get this data really quick and see the very foundations of the house through which you're trying to define the nature of the planets inside the house. Because the house is the foundational field which acts through and ultimately creates the foundation for the planet. So, points of prosperity. House Lord Mercury. Now we're looking at Mercury as the house lord. Does the house lord itself, as we would know from our list, is the house lord conjunct or aspected by a benefic? Well, as we know from the Jaimini Karakas, essentially any planet in a fixed sign gets Rashi aspects by all the cardinal houses except for the one right next to it. So Leo gets aspects from Libra, Capricorn, and Aries, not Cancer. Venus is in the sign of Libra, which means Venus is Rashi aspecting Mercury here. So that's a point of prosperity for the fourth house, because the fourth house is Lord, is Mercury. Venus being in Libra deeply helps the nature of this fourth house. We could say that Venus being in Libra in the fifth house, Venus's social sphere is helping to ground Leo, in fact, the house of Leo where Mercury is, which it's Rashi aspecting Mercury itself. So the social qualities of the social qualities of Venus in Libra are bringing out the best of the Mercury in Leo, which is glorious and seeks to have entertaining value and to speak, especially as the first Lord Mercury here. You know, Charlie Sheen, his Venus probably added a sweetness to his speech and to the fourth house qualities of Virgo that we're looking at. These are the kind of tie-ins that you got to tie all together, right? Now let's look at this Jagrat thing. Is the house lord awake? What does awake mean? Awake means in its own home, Mula Tricona, exaltation, or to lesser degrees, great friend and friend. Now this, I would call this a full point to prosperity, because Mercury is actually in a great friend sign, that being the sun. It's a temporary friend and also a permanent friend, which we learned from our last video on dignity. So we call that a point of prosperity. And then this last point of prosperity is Mercury and or Jupiter Rashi aspecting the house itself. So this is the fourth house of Virgo, and yes, Jupiter is in Gemini, and by the activity of Jupiter in Gemini, a mutable sign, it is also affecting Virgo, which is also a mutable sign. It's also affecting Pisces and Sagittarius, of course, because that's just the nature of these Rashi aspects. So Jupiter provides support as a power transducer in the same way that Mercury does, which is cool because Mercury's own sign, Leo, is being helped by the nature of Mercury. But the house, the sign of Virgo itself, Mercury's ruling house, Virgo, where these outer planets are, have the benefit of Jupiter's nature expressing itself, as we said in the beginning, with joyousness, with no holds barred, with fearlessness. Jupiter, by expressing this through Gemini, is inherently aiding the self-expression, self-awareness, and integration of the fourth house. Jupiter Rashi aspecting Virgo itself. Jupiter Rashi aspecting the fourth house itself. Right? So it's 3 points of prosperity. What's the annihilation all about? Because it looks like we've got more annihilation than good. The house lord does not Rashi aspect its own house. Mercury does not Rashi aspect Virgo. Let's see. House is occupied by a malefic. Is the house occupied by a malefic? Yes. The sun is in Virgo. And guess what else? The house itself... this is one where I should actually fix this down here, the annihilation of a house. These are my own notes, but these notes come from this actual quote from Parashara. Parashara says, the Bhava whose lord is with a malefic planet, or the lord or the actual house is conjunct or with one of the lords of evil in such other houses. 3, 6, 8, 11, 12. So the actual house is with one of the lords of evil, which is the sun. Oh my gosh, I always do this. So the house itself is occupied by the evil third house lord, the sun. And it's also occupied by a malefic, which is the sun. Sun has a double negativity here for the fourth house. Not only that, but the Lord, the Sun, the Lord Mercury is in Vriddha Avashta, which is 18 to 24 degrees of an odd sign. So Mercury, holding down the fourth house, is also old, has a hard time coming to grips with what its nature is as a house and how to express that through this incarnation, through the energy field at hand. So that's a whole lot about all that. We see ultimately that there's more. It's hard to say. I'm kind of leaning towards unstable, as we're going to see in the end of this. Overall, this is all leaning towards unstable. But it's pretty neutral in a lot of ways. sort of equal points of prosperity and annihilation, but that's usually how you'll find it. A lot of the times, it's only when there's a drastic difference that you go, oh wow, look at this that's going on here. But even though, the sun has 3.5 points of prosperity and only two of annihilation, the sun is even less important than Mercury itself. And Mercury itself is the one with a whole point of annihilation over its prosperity. It does get lots of help from Venus. Mercury itself gets help from Venus, and the house itself gets help from Jupiter, which in this case is very good because that's where the outer planets actually are, as well as the sun. So there's some good. It's kind of in the middle. Now, will Mercury be able to easily nurture the potentials in its nature with the help of the field which it works through, the third house of Leo? We would say yes. Leo having 3.5 points of prosperity over annihilation. The house itself, the third house of Leo, has got support. And we would say that Mercury wouldn't have such a bad time where it is in its house. So what does this say about the capacity for Mercury to meet its necessary potentials through the third house? Of course, we read as a Bhava Yoga, we were reading about the fourth lord in the third house. We were reading things like the inner fulfillment, the emotional exploration comes through an exploring, a desirousness. Now, this desirous nature kind of sucks. It's not a good thing to have your fourth lord in the third house because the emotional stability that the fourth house seeks is trying to express it through a very searching, seeking third house, which basically means that it'll only get little streaks, little stripes of deep inner emotional satisfaction and self-realization as its nature. Charlie Sheen will aggressively seek out and find ways to connect his nature to hobbies and recreational things through the third house, because the third house is well placed. Even though that's frustrating, as we've said, even though the sun is considered inauspicious to Gemini Lagna, this is the sun in that third house is important to Mercury. It's a frustrating thing for Mercury have to work through, but it does, and it gets prosperity from that. It finds ways to connect its nature to its hobbies and activities. Again, this really for me says a lot about Sheen's wispy. A lot of Mercury is tied into this because he's a Gemini Lagna, so it's his self, where his Rahu is too. It's this wittiness. There's a real wittiness here that has support from Mercury being in the third house. Not only is the fourth house coming through the third, but also the first. So this wittiness, which can frustrate friends and family, we could see that it's possible that he finds positive channels for this Geminian wittiness that even gives his family some enjoyment. His lovers, the people close to him, that's all fourth house stuff. Lovers, per se, is more of a seventh house thing, but lovers that count as your emotional foundation and domestic reality, he will have found some positive expressions with them through the third house at least. But the content which is being expressed in this witty way is the fourth house itself. This is the next question. How's that actual fourth house emotional content doing? Well, first of all, this is sort of an in-between question. Will the sun be able to easily nurture the potentials of its nature with the help of the field which it works through, the fourth house of Virgo? Less likely, which is an annoying two-way feedback because the sun supports Mercury, but Mercury supports the sun, but the sun supports Mercury. So, the sun here is having a bit of a harder time sitting where it is, and same with the outer planets. Unfortunately, this is the bigger picture here. The sun, as well as those outer planets, are being agitated by all of these annihilation factors, mostly coming from the sun, you'll notice. Also coming from the Vriddavashta thing. So the sun has a harder time with the potentials of its nature in the field that it's in, Virgo, right? Even though it's in the house of a great friend. See, this is why we've got to take all these different steps and layers. You can't just read the dignity and say, oh, this sun is good to go. The house itself, that being Virgo here, shows a lot of points of annihilation. Although, I mean, again, even this Jagratness is only in a great friend sign. It's not actually exalted or Mula Tricona. Mercury does get assistance from Venus, and Jupiter assists the house itself, but these are some pretty big points of annihilation. So it's a bit of a so-so thing. There will be times when Jupiter is supporting the fourth house, but when Jupiter is in a bad place and can't help anything, it's in a bad transit, or it's, it's in like Capricorn in transit, or, any sort of thing like this, or if the sun goes through like a transit of Saturn, which is like antagonistic to Jupiter, perhaps these things will uproot the positivity that Jupiter or Venus gives and make the harder times. So the goodness of the fourth house could shift due to transits and dashas. Now, what does this say about the sun carrying it through its agenda? Makes it a little bit tougher. Makes it not always solid for the sun's capacity as the third lord to express itself in the fourth house. So again, there's a funny thing going on here. The seeking of the self wants to express through the fourth house. So the third house, the third lord, is the sun, and it's trying to find fun, exciting things to do. And the fourth house is a little bit stodgy, especially because the sun, being a malefic and the evil third house lord, it's kind of that aggressiveness is wrecking the inner peace, which the sun seeks to express itself through. If Charlie Sheen had inner peace, he could do much more of his third house exploring and wandering. But the fact that the third lord is in this fourth house, and that it's the sun, is ironically crippling its own capacity to enjoy its emotional foundation. This is a sun being in the fourth house, which it aggressively desires an emotional foundation in order that can conduct itself, and it feels glorified by collecting a fourth house, a positive fourth house, which means it like holds its lover tightly. You need to be with me, and the lover's like, you're hurting me, So either that, or the third lord is in the fourth house. Yeah, so it's very aggressive about its domestic reality. And the domestic reality itself can only give the sun so much of what it seeks because the fourth house has this ill prosperity. And finally, what does this say about Mercury's ability to channel its house occupants' energies? Notice the pink paint down there, which means that we're talking particularly in relevance to the outer planets. All of this goes to say that the outer planets themselves are also having a hard time finding stability. The outer planets want to have some kind of solid emotional foundation, which they can kind of tear up, give the person, Charlie Sheen, chaotic energies through Uranus, as well as egoic energies and mob gangster energies through Pluto in the fourth house. And these planets want the fourth house to stabilize despite these outer planet rippling energies. And the fourth house, if the fourth house was strong and it had prosperity, then it would have an easier time stabilizing, catching, and even transmuting the energy coming from these outer planets. But because of the sun, because of the Vriddha Avashta of Mercury, mostly because of the sun, the malefic and evil third lord energy of the sun cripples the emotional foundation which these outer planets are standing on. This also says a lot about these outer planets being conjunct the sun. We could even talk about that in this chart, but we don't really get into that here as much. So all things considered, again, this is just a crash course, so we're giving you all the things you need to consider when considering an outer planet's agenda in its house, as relates to a significant point in the chart. Thus far, we can see auspiciousness to the Lagna, neutral. Dignity, stable. Prosperity of the houses, neutral, leaning towards unstable. Even though we combine the totals, we see that the Sun and Mercury together have more prosperity than annihilation. Still, Mercury is the more important one here. And it has more annihilation than the Sun has prosperity. But more importantly, Mercury has more annihilation than its own prosperity. The Sun can help that, but the fourth house itself lacks a little bit of prosperity. I would call it neutral, but it's leaning towards unstable. I don't know if that was frustrating for you guys to go through all that and then say, okay, great, it's neutral. What do I even do with that? But this is important. So far, the picture that we're seeing of Charlie Sheen's chart is kind of leaning towards neutral. Even like the dignity is positive. So there's some positive potentials for what we can see as some positive expressions of this fourth and third house yoga that we're seeing. Even though Charlie Sheen, we know him to be super crazy and super whack and all these things, there's underlying elements of his chart that are expressing what his soul seeks to express, especially through these outer planets and the energy of the outer planets, right? There's so much craziness in Charlie Sheen's fourth house, and it eventually, over time especially, they all congeal. As we're going to see, start getting to more unstable stuff now. But just to note that there are roots which have the possibility of a positive expression, and this is why he got wives. Charlie Sheen did get wives. He did enjoy himself. He did find ways of expressing this chaotic, ecstatic Uranus in the fourth house energy, as well as the Pluto in the fourth house energy, through what he got to be, through what he was. They had a hard time expressing through the fourth house, and we're going to talk about all that as we go along. But so far, it doesn't look bad for Charlie Sheen's third and fourth house-ish, somewhat, sort of. It's not leaning heavily towards the unstable just yet. It's mostly neutral. So that was our lesson today on the prosperity of the houses and Rashi aspects of the house and the house lord that relates to, which carries the occupying outer planet energy. The house itself, of course, as we know, is the field through which the Lord has to express its energy. It's the field, the way in which the universe conspires to deal with the nature of the planet energy, right? Next up, we're going to be looking at Shadbala, which is an important figure for any chart interpretation. It's astrology unto itself. We're going to see what that is like in regards to channeling the energy of an outer planet. Hope you guys enjoyed this. I'm Dustin Cormier. I'll see you guys in the next episode.